and welcome. My name is Emily Walsh Martin, and I'm the host of The Issue on the ASGCT podcast network. For those of you who don't know me, 2024 will mark a decade of my career spent in gene and cell therapy program leadership and management. Before that, I spent a decade in small molecule siRNA and therapeutic protein drug development. So when ASGCT approached me to host this podcast, I quickly realized that I had an opportunity to provide a service. Specifically, I could try to demystify topics that frankly blew my mind when I was just starting out as a program lead on an AAV-delivered zinc finger gene editing program so many years ago. So that's what we'll try to do. Over the next few months, we are going to have conversations with old colleagues and new friends. We will talk about how we got to where we are personally, as well as an industry, and more importantly, what we've learned along the way. And since all of my career has been working on cross-functional teams, we'll be surveying the gene and cell therapy landscape from a cross-functional perspective. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you'll stick around. Before we get started, the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy is the largest, most comprehensive membership community dedicated to cell and gene therapy. Now is the perfect time to join and/or renew your membership. If the simple act of joining isn't its own reward, here are 5 additional reasons why you should join right now. Number 1, membership will be valid from the date you join until the end of 2024. Number 2, publication discounts are available to you for the molecular therapy family of journals. 3, free virtual events throughout the year. 4, fantastic registration discounts on some of my favorite events like the Policy Summit and the Spotlight on Immuno-Oncology. But most importantly, registration for the 27th annual meeting is now open, and ASGCT members can save up to $385 on registration. The meeting is May 7th through 11th in Baltimore, and this is the one meeting you need every year to keep up to date on advancements in our field. And now, back to our conversation on the issue brought to you on the ASGCT Podcast Network. Welcome to our first episode, and our guest is Dr. Michael Storey from Nationwide Children's Hospital. Today, we're going to dive into the patient experience and try to build a connection between cell and gene therapy developers and the patients they are ultimately trying to serve. Michael, welcome to the podcast. How are you today? Doing well?
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Great. On your LinkedIn, your role at Nationwide is listed as medication use strategist. Help decrypt that for folks. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I wear a variety of different hats around the organization. And so as we were trying to put the right title into it, this title kind of came to the surface. I also coordinate the operations of our pharmacy and therapeutics committee at the organization. And then I lead the onboarding of various therapies around the organization. So certainly gene and cell therapy are a major part of that role, but I also am involved in onboarding other new therapies like vaccines and other things that are used much more broadly than some gene therapies that may be used for more rare diseases.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. And when you say, onboarding them, like what does that sort of entail for you?
Yeah. So I work with the manufacturers and I work with the clinicians at the hospital to say, what do we need organizationally to be able to offer this therapy to our patients? And then I work within the operations team and with our finance team here at the hospital to say, what guardrails do we need to put up? And then what infrastructure needs to be created in order to make these therapies available in a way that is sustainable, but also making sure that we are prioritizing patient access. And so I really say I sit at the nexus of finance, operations, and clinical work as I see patients and am involved in clinical team meetings. But I also am working with our finance team and with our operations team to make sure that we have what we need to make sure we create sustainable programs.
Got it. So, from what you said there, just to double click on it, it's sort of like everything from making sure you have the right -80 freezer set up, probably, to knitting together all the steps in getting the approval, the prior approval if needed for the therapy, and then going that final step to actually getting the patient the therapy administered. Is that the way to think about it?
Yeah, so I might see the patient when they're first in clinic, and have a conversation with them about what this process looks like, with the insurance, and then also with just some of the logistics at a patient appropriate level. And then, making sure that we have everything we need in the pharmacy, and making sure that we have a plan for how we're going to be able to take care of these patients longitudinally in the clinic, and working with our operations team to make sure that we have clinic space and everything else that's necessary to do that. And really just trying to make sure that we can kind of get ahead of some of these things. It's good to know before a drug gets approved, what does our patient volume look like? What does what do these patients look like in terms of where they live and everything like that? What are any special needs that this patient population might have, and being able to communicate that within the organization. So it's really important that we have advanced planning for some of these therapies so that we're able to provide them effectively to patients and feel prepared when they come. Certainly there will always be learnings as we give initial doses of a drug or any other therapy to a patient, but we definitely want to try to be as prepared as possible. And a lot of that comes with pre-planning.
Absolutely. So it sounds like, and remind me, you have a pharmacy degree. So it sounds like you're really sort of flying high, flying low in terms of probably some parts of your job are super technical and some parts are inherently meant to de-technify, right? So that you can communicate with patients better and make sure that they understand the big picture.
Yeah, I certainly have to be able to understand the nuance of the details. And so I think a lot of people may sit in one world or another and they'll say, I'm a clinician, but I'm not going to I don't either want to know about the finances or I don't know about the finances. And I have to be able to kind of take what I'm hearing from our finance team and be able to translate that to them. And then similarly, when I'm working with our clinical team, be able to take that information and to communicate the level of urgency, the patient's clinical status to our finance team, and really make sure that everybody stays on the same page and everything. And also working, with drug manufacturers. There's certain nuances around, drug distribution and supply chain that the average clinician is certainly not going to be familiar with, and being able to navigate all of that is, I think, a really important thing to make sure that we're able to offer these therapies.
Yeah. So, the next question I had for you is probably a tough one, which is what's a day in the life of your job like? Because it probably depends.
Yeah, there's definitely no typical day. I certainly have days where I spend more time in a clinic or in meetings. There's definitely project days where I'm, involved with writing SOPs, filing prior authorizations, working on keeping things current for our pharmacy and therapeutics committee. So there's a lot of different things that I'm doing, but I most days come into the office and working and working with a variety of different people around the organization. And I think that's what I like. I really like the variety of my job, in that I can be in a meeting, 1 hour with a patient, and then in the next hour I can be in a meeting with our senior executive team having a conversation. And that ability to, move between those different areas is really quite interesting and fascinating. So
yeah, no, I get that as well. That definitely resonates with me. So what brought you to this career? Did how did you get to where you are?
So I was exposed to pharmacy when I was really young. My mom's a pharmacist. I went to lots of pharmacy conferences with her, not necessarily at all related to what I do today, but I got to know a lot of pharmacists, and I think what I really liked was kind of this nexus of having some of this business acumen involved, while at the same time still having a clinical role. And so I originally like wanted to own my own pharmacy and stuff, which is something that desire disappeared in pharmacy school. But I really got to see how I can be involved in patient care, and that was something that was much more interesting to me. And nonetheless, kind of that business stuff was still there for me, and I was still very interested in continuing that. So after pharmacy school, I did pharmacy administration residency, which is something that several sites around the country offer. I did that at Ohio State, which is one of the long established programs here in Columbus. After that, I came to Nationwide Children's, held a variety of operational and clinical roles, clinical operation and clinical management roles before moving into my current role. And so I think through all those experiences, I developed a lot of relationships around the organization. I was managing our oncology pharmacy services as well as our infusion services. And so being able to kind of, understand those and a lot of the clinicians who interface with those areas, I think helped me be successful in this role once I transitioned into this role. I think it also is important to note that I started this role January 1st of 2017, which was just a couple weeks after Spinraza, nusinersen, was approved. And with that approval, it really, I think, ignited some of the energy around high cost therapies around the organization. And even though that's not perhaps what many would consider to be classically a gene or cell therapy, started a lot of the conversations that I think have continued at organizations that now are being had about gene and cell therapies.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I think you there are definitely a few products out there that, while they may not strictly be gene and cell therapies, certainly share a lot of the same complexities and require the same level of thoughtfulness, sort of in sort of getting that final step of access completed for patients.
Yeah, I mean, I think with nusinersen, for example, with the intrathecal route and the need for, then having a provider available who's credentialed to give that therapy, made it a lot more complicated than, having an oral therapy approved or something like that, you kind of would send the prescription or dispense the prescription from the pharmacy, but there's not as much of a rate limiting step of having that provider available. And then, the ongoing nature of these therapies as well adds a different level of complexity. But definitely, now with gene and cell therapies, we have similar challenges with making sure that we have everybody who is available and, thinking about that even more longitudinally beyond that infusion date about how we're going to be able to take care of those patients.
Yeah. And I guess just from my point of view as a developer, one of the things I know that development teams that I work on think a lot about is that sort of that final step of administration, right? And the complexities of, maybe needing additional expertises in the room to do that, et cetera, which obviously would be the case for an intrathecal or some sort of intracerebral therapy. That certainly is probably a big challenge for accessing novel cell and gene therapies. Are there others in your mind beyond that are really important ones?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one is making sure that you have the ability to make sure that you get IV access and good IV access. I think one of the things for us that we do with gene therapies is that we require that the patient has two IV access points, for example, because, we know these therapies, you get one shot. And so if the potential that a patient were to lose IV access, we need to be able to immediately resume that infusion. The potential that, we could have that drug expire, and it's not like anybody is keeping more of this on their shelf to, continue the infusion later that day or something if that product were to expire. So there's a lot of different things like that we really have to be thinking about. And I think that's been something that we've, had to put a lot of thought into as we've been planning out our gene and cell therapy plans. I think one of the things as we think about like, that last step is really thinking about what are the supplies that are needed. What is the preparation process look like? Where is that preparation going to happen? So, with some of the cell therapies, for example, we have pretty short thaw times from the time that something is thawed until it needs to be infused. So you have to make sure that is be able to be done locally.
Absolutely. One of the things you just said there was the concept of different kinds of expiry, right? Like it's not just the expiry of the frozen material that drug development teams obviously have to think about, but they also need to think about the sort of in-use stability, which is what you're talking about in terms of the time it takes between thaw and administration, and how long can that be? How long can it be extended to give teams on your side of the coin the enough time to be effective in administering at the end of the day?
Yeah. So, I mean, basically you have the stability of the frozen product, which is obviously as it comes. In most cases, it's frozen. Some cases we get it refrigerated and everything, but in most cases, we're talking about a frozen product. And then you have the stability of that once it's thawed, but still in the original storage container. And then you have the stability after it's drawn out of that and into a syringe or put into a bag, and what that is. And so it's important to be able to articulate all of those and then understand, are these expiries the time that, for the finished product, for example, is this time by which it needs to be hung, or the time by which the infusion needs to be finished? And so being able to, spell all of that out so that our team throughout the process is aware of that is really important. So if you have a cell therapy that maybe only is stable for 30 minutes, that may inform where that needs to be prepared, whether that's at the bedside or in a pharmacy space very proximal to that, for example. Or if you have something that it's good for 6 hours, but it may take 2, 3, or 4 hours to infuse, you need to be aware that pauses in that infusion or delays in starting that infusion could impact that, and how you need to be thinking about all of those things. And so for us, we make sure that everything is ready to go before we thaw a drug. So communication is obviously critical to say, okay, we're all set to go, now we begin. And that clock can start to tick, because we don't want to end up in a situation where we have obviously one of these therapies that is no longer useful for this patient, which obviously for a cell therapy, that might be the only option because it's they only were able to make one dose. Or for a gene therapy, like an AAV therapy, for example, you now may have to delay that therapy, and certainly you can't repeat it. And so it's really important that we have all of that well thought out and well planned so that everyone is ready to go.
Absolutely. So any other sort of major challenges that you see in terms of getting patient access to novel gene and cell therapies?
Yeah. So, well, I think one of the other, challenges I think that you and I have talked about a little bit in the past too is around how exactly it's supplied to the provider. And so, a lot of times people think, well, it doesn't matter how many vials we do, in the clinical trials, they were able to manage it that way. But there are actual real access implications to having too many vials, for example. Many smaller hospitals, maybe these are not the places that you did your original clinical trials, but if you're a trial sponsor, you may be going to smaller hospitals with an approved product. And they're going to say, well, this is great, but in many cases, for example, a lot of smaller pediatric hospitals only have one hazardous clean room and maybe only one hood in that room. So if it takes 2 hours to prepare your product, it's not just about the staff that they need to find for each of those doses. It's also that they need to have hood space, because they can't shut down their oncology infusion area, for example, for 2 hours to prepare this dose. And so then we start talking about them thinking about doing it on odd hours and other things like that can be really complicated. So I do think it's important to think about some of that formulation at the beginning. I think there's other like nuances, like how many syringes is this going to take? And then what does that actually look like when you're doing that infusion? How often do you need to change a syringe or a bag? Can you put it all in a larger bag instead of putting it in multiple bags? These are all things that appear in FDA approved package inserts. And when you actually, review some of these things, you say, couldn't they have done something different? And I think a lot of people are saying, well, this is what we did. There's a little bit of a just deal with it, Mike. And the reality is I can deal with it, but there are implications for access to patients more broadly at a societal level. And I think that as we see more and more second to market products, one, it's an opportunity to learn from the past. And two, it may be a competitive advantage for products if they're easier for sites to manage and provide.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And when we pre-met, we talked about this a little bit. It was because this was a comment you made at the policy summit. So, everyone should attend the policy summit. But setting that aside, it was really interesting to hear you say that on stage, like the number of vials, what gives. And it's funny because when you said it, I was like, I actually know why. I know why, because when you're working on these programs at the earliest stages, and let's just take an AAV as an example. A lot of times when you put the material on stability in order to initially set up the expiry expectations for your product, you need to do sort of pulls of the drug in a representative container at a number of time points. And oftentimes the tests that you have to do, the assays that you have to run on those drugs require an entire vial. Now, they might not take all the volume in that vial, but because they are being done by different laboratories or different CROs, like you end up pulling an entire vial to send it for one dedicated test. And so oftentimes early in development, teams will err on the side of having a lot of vials for a single dose in order to minimize the loss of the drug product to those studies. And you're right. I think one of the transitions that it's important for every program to make, especially when you're in phase 2 or when you're sort of further down the line and that this product is doing great and has a likelihood of success, is to start to convert the container closures to something that is going to be more friendly for access. Because you're right, at this point, there's not a ton of things in your -80 freezer. But eventually, as more and more drugs are approved in this space, those freezers are going to fill up, and the more we can be thoughtful about what that path looks like, from pulling it out of the freezer, storing it in the freezer, pulling it out of the freezer, and then administering it, the better we're going to be positioning ourselves to help patients. So I thought that was it was great that we sort of had this moment, me in the crowd and you on the stage. I was like, I actually know the answer.
Yeah.
Why
that
happens.
I think there's also, we talk about -80s, and I think we think of this in the gene and cell therapy world as a pretty standard thing. But I think it's really important to note that in most hospitals before the COVID-19 pandemic, there were not -80 freezers. And so to bring a product into a hospital for a clinical trial or commercially that was stored frozen at -80 was kind of a big deal, and something that many hospitals would just say, well, we can't do this. We're not going to buy a $20,000 freezer that takes up a lot of space, is kind of loud. And there's some ongoing significant operating expense associated with that for one product. Now, all of us brought in these freezers for the COVID-19 vaccines, and suddenly we're all like, okay, now we have these freezers, and fortunately they're mostly empty now. So there's now opportunity, I think, for that. But I think it's definitely something that previously would have been actually a really big barrier.
Right. Yeah. No, and I think that very much sort of hammers home sort of the change in, if you will, market conditions or operational conditions can have interesting, unexpected impacts on access. So I'd like to maybe change subjects just a little bit, and because we've just talked about sort of the drugs journey in your institution, but I'm also sort of curious from your perspective, what's the average journey like for a newly diagnosed patient for whom the idea is that they may be appropriate to receive a gene or cell therapy? What is that journey like?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously this depends somewhat as we think about gene and cell therapies from product to product. There's urgency differences and things like that that play some role. But I think for us, it's really, spelling out for that patient what that looks like for them. So it's talking about insurance. We have different types of insurance challenges that we can face. And so when I think about those, I think about different types of insurance denials that we can encounter. So one is around just medical necessity, and that could be related to restrictive medical policy. In some cases, especially with some of these with accelerated approvals, we're seeing some insurers that just say, we're just not going to cover this, period. Now, they may end up covering it when you go through an extensive appeals process, but there's no guarantee of that. And so, I do think that there's a big opportunity in the arena to really be thinking about how do we think about accelerated approval and how ought we position those products, because there definitely is, access implications there. And then the other thing I think that doesn't get enough attention is around excluded benefit situations. And so this is where employer sponsored health plans can choose to make decisions about the types of therapies that they will and will not cover. And so, classically, obviously, we think about things like elective plastic surgery or lifestyle medicine types of things, right? And these are the types of things that we generally would think, oh, well, insurer is going to exclude that. But there are insurers who are writing into their policies that gene therapy is not a covered benefit. And so when we encounter these situations, I think there's a variety of different ways that we work through them. But I think that the overarching issue from a societal standpoint is that we really need to be having this conversation in our communities with our chambers of commerce and with others who are making those decisions. Because every time that I've seen that happen, when I actually talk to the employer and the person who made that decision, they had no idea about the decision they were making. They didn't realize that there was some life-changing therapy for some kid that was going to preclude. And the other implication for them is that their stop loss carrier, because it's excluded from their plan, isn't going to cover it. So it's just like if you have $1 million in art in your home and you don't tell your insurance company about that and your house burns down, well, the insurance company is not going to cover that art. And so similarly, if you don't say we're going to cover gene therapy, well, your reinsurance policy for that employer, for that insurance policy, is not going to cover and exclude something that's not covered by the plan when the plan decides to override that. And so I've seen employers who have had to spend far more to actually offer that therapy to their member, because it was something that, had they known, they would have absolutely covered in the first place. And so I think getting the word out about gene and cell therapy, and that this is an essential medical benefit that should be covered under health plans, is really a critical message that I think everyone needs to hear. I will tell you, there are people involved in the gene and cell therapy industry who are corporations that do not cover gene and cell therapy for their employees.
It's funny.
This is shocking thing.
That was going to be my next question to you. So, thanks for sharing that. Yeah. So I have so many thoughts running through my head right now. Number one, I guess for me, is encouraging I guess I wonder, are they aware that they're not covering it? Or is this sort of like they get surprised by it because,
I think that in most cases, the person who's involved in making that decision is far removed from the core business. So, this is somebody in HR who's making a decision, and they're making a decision about coverage for their plan. And they're saying, look, by putting this clause, some consultant is telling them, by putting this clause in there, you'll save a few bucks per employee per month on your insurance premium for the reinsurance. And so there's somebody there telling them that. But that is completely disconnected from the people who are making strategic business decisions that they want to become involved in the gene and cell therapy industry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I guess one of the things that this might behoove listeners to do is to ask their benefits manager what they're currently covering, and perhaps inspire a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it is it is definitely one of those things where family, if some families become more or less public about these situations and
Right.
everything as well. And I like I say, I don't think that these are ill-intentioned decisions. I
Right.
think they're
Exactly.
uninformed decisions.
Right.
And so I think just being out there and having that conversation with, the major employers in your area, or, just with your own company,
Right.
I think is really important.
And it's rapidly changing. I mean, again, yeah, I think you're right. I assume that everyone's got the right intentions, and it's a rapidly evolving field. We've got increasing numbers of approvals of these kinds of drugs, and it's not surprising, that things just haven't caught up everywhere. But perhaps it behooves us all to ask the question of what the current status is at our own workplaces. Yeah, wow. So help me understand this. So from let's say patient arrives, they have their diagnosis. It's clear that clinically, this therapy might be appropriate for them, and you start to do the discussions around with the payers to try and get the reimbursement path all sorted out. What does that length of time? What's the range of time that can take?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different situations there. So one is where you actually have a contract in place. And so it is my ideal that we have contracts in place so that we're not delaying patient therapy to negotiate a contract. The reality is that, especially for new therapies, this takes quite a while to get that integrated into umbrella contracts at a hospital. And some of the payers really don't want to engage too much until there is a patient, because they just say, well, we may be negotiating something that we'll never actually have to do anything with. And so, ultimately that's the ideal, but a lot of times we have to negotiate a single case agreement. And so, that's a situation where we're going to say, this is our case rate, and, really work with the payer to come to something that is agreeable. And be able to offer that therapy to the patient. And so it's a challenge to have that conversation while there's a patient stuck in the middle. But nonetheless, that does occasionally happen. And so we want to try to, get those conversations going as quickly as possible and as soon as possible. But that hasn't always worked. I will say for our team, we reach out to our payers when drugs are approved. So if you have something, when a gene therapy is approved, I have, already briefed our finance team and our contracting team on this therapy, and they're immediately trying to reach out to the folks who they work with at each of these payers. But a lot of times they're still waiting on guidance from, their leadership about what's an agreeable, principle upon which to have that discussion. And so it takes some time for that to happen. And then, obviously everything that has to go through legal and get that sorted out and and then contracts have start dates on them, which are usually some date in the future. So there's a lot of those details that all have to get worked out. And so we, inevitably we end up having to do some single case agreements.
Got it. So it sounds like, when a drug newly comes on the market, there's some lead time, right? Before it's sort of fully interpreted and understood, and sort of what the path is going to be. And then for drugs that are on the market, you may still find these hiccups where you have an exception for the insurance that that patient has, or something like that. Is it on the order of, delaying therapy by weeks? Is it more like months? Could it be years? What have you seen?
So I've seen these single case agreements come together in 24 hours, and I've seen them
Wow.
take weeks. So, okay. I think overall, we really try to make it so that it does not delay therapy. I can't say that never is the case, though. Right. And so, trying to work as proactively as possible is really the important thing there. But obviously, we're talking about pretty significant contracts. I think it's interesting when as products are brought to market, a lot of times contracting discussions between payers and the manufacturer are happening in advance. Those conversations don't seem to be possible between providers and payers prior to the FDA approval. I mean, granted, obviously, nobody ever knows what the dollar amount is, what it's going to be priced. But I always say, like, there's principles upon which we can negotiate that, regardless of what that list price is, it should flow from that.
Yep. And I guess, how many other places like Nationwide are there that are there a lot of, I guess the question is, how does this scale? Like it feels like that Nationwide's doing an amazing job of being proactive, reaching out to payers, like trying to engage them early to try and grease the wheels of access, if you will. Is this something that basically has to be repeated by every sort of center of excellence for these kinds of therapies?
Yeah, I mean, definitely every center is going to deal with these same issues. The level of proactivity may vary between them, but overall, you're going to hit these bumps one way or another.
Yeah.
And so it's definitely something that, I don't know. I mean, I can't speak for what everyone else does. I mean,
Right.
I obviously have those conversations with different people, but everybody has their own structure for how they make those decisions and what they do. But a lot of it is also that you're never going to perfectly predict your volumes for these therapies. You're never going to perfectly predict which patients are going to ultimately qualify and be able to do that in advance. So there's always going to be some hiccups with all of this. And I will say, even in just doing the prior authorizations, if you've done one prior authorization, you've done one prior authorization. It is much messier to deal with a lot of these gene therapies. Many of them go through specialized offices, which is great. The key is making sure that when you call into a general line, you get redirected back to that specialty office rather than trying to go through, a normal authorization process or something. And so, usually when I get those people involved, they know what's going on. They may not be the ones who are doing payer contracting with hospitals. They may not be the ones who are, doing contracting with the manufacturers, but they know who the people are who are doing that. They know who to notify. They know the urgency of the therapy, frankly. I mean, a lot of these, specialized people are really, they're familiar with these patients. They've talked to the patient families as well. They understand that. And so making sure that I'm able to get to somebody who's able to do that is pretty important.
Right. Yeah, no, it seems like so much of what we do in gene and cell therapy truly is a team effort. And it's amazing sort of all the different touch points and people involved in order to, bring these therapies eventually to the patient. All right, so we're at the end of our time, and I do have a final question, which I'm wondering if you could wave a magic wand today and fix one thing about gene and cell therapy development that would totally make your job easier. What would you change? What would you fix?
Yeah, so I had a hard time coming up with one thing here. So I have two, and I think they're on two different things. So I think the one is around that operations piece and how that works in terms of actually preparing the product, storing the product, things like that. And I think what I would really like is to have manufacturers connect early on, pre-IND, or certainly before, if you're going to do a transition study to your commercial product, before doing that, with a group of pharmacy leaders who are in operations. And I will say this is not necessarily the people who you're working with during investigational studies, in investigational drug service. This is, operations managers and directors at hospitals around the country, who are different sizes and stuff too, basically a representative population of the hospitals who you expect to offer your product. And so what I've generally seen is that those conversations happen too late. And then that's where we end up with different situations that are just suboptimal, I think. There's sometimes they'll put a specific gauge of a needle, and I'm like, I've never used that gauge of a needle. Why is this in this information, And you could have just left that out of the prescribing information, and the FDA would have been okay, because guess what? No other drug actually says the gauge of needle that you have to use to prepare it. But by putting that in there, now suddenly I'm like, okay, now I need to go find, this specific detail. And so I think trying to work through some of those things in advance will help make things a lot easier and avoid some of the constant repeat questions after approval. The other thing I think is really about this situation of insurance exclusions. I think that being able to say that gene therapy is an essential component of healthcare coverage, I think is really important. And I think a lot of people will say, well, this is grandfathered in from before the ACA and stuff. And I would say, let's be clear. At the time of the ACA, there were no gene therapies that were FDA approved. So for any of us who want to say that that this was a grandfathered provision of the ACA, that was certainly never congressional intent of the ACA saying that ERISA plans could be grandfathered. And I don't think these clauses were in those plans. And so I think it's important that we kind of think through some of that as we think about what essential benefits actually are, and that we have these conversations with large employers and small employers as well, to make sure that they're offering the full spectrum of care for their employees and their members.
And to your earlier point, it seems like for the average listener to this podcast, the first place they could start maybe is with their own employer, right?
Right.
ensuring that their own employer is aware of the existence of these kinds of exclusions, and make sure that that's not going to be a problem.
And the place to find this in your plan documents is a section that says plan exclusions. Every plan's going to have them. So you will have plan exclusions. It's okay to have plan exclusions on a healthcare benefit. I mean, you almost have to, but on some level. But so that's where you want to look in that. And every employer should be willing to provide a packet of the full plan documents to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Michael, thank you so very much for joining us on the podcast today. I really appreciate, number one, that you spent the time with us, but number two, the work that you're doing every day. I think that sometimes on early discovery or development teams, like the kind of teams that I serve on, it seems like forever until these therapies are actually going to be in the hands of patients and prescribers. But I think we can't forget that that's where we're headed, and we need to start with that end in mind. And so your thoughtfulness and candor today have been fantastic sort of primers, I think, for all our listeners who might be earlier in the pipeline of developing these drugs. So thank you very much, Michael.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is a lot of fun. I appreciate it.